Okay, welcome. So you're going to be watching, this is the second lecture of the same day, okay? Make sure you follow the syllabus if there's any confusion in what we're doing. Oh, sounds like my timer is being quite loud. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Cool. So we're now at lecture 3, a little bit of brief history into our discipline. So Five Guys is, I think they have the best burgers for burger chain shops in the US. Mostly they're very popular in the Midwest, but you can also find them around Ithaca, for instance, for students who are international. When you do come to the US, make sure that maybe you should try it. I agree. I am not a burger person, but I think they're good. But this is a great way, actually, for us to remember that some of these so-called founding fathers, very important figures in establishing sociology as a discipline, most of them lived in around 19th century to 20th century, okay, starting from 19th century, right? And there were 5 of them: Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, Emily Durkheim, George Simmel, and Max Weber. And Comte, Durkheim were French, the other 2 were German. And 3 of them I kind of highlighted in green because in many other countries, they are usually considered as like the 3 founding fathers out of all of the, even out of the 5. So they're always kind of talked about as within the canon. Okay? If you have never heard of the word canon, I think it's right here. It simply means things that we consider as the classic, the most important work historically for this discipline. We do look into a little bit of history, but also very importantly, at the very end, that's why today's lecture has a beyond element. Okay? In addition to knowing what these founding fathers were doing for sociology and what similarities and differences were in there, we can also be thinking about how did they become founding fathers and what are the people that could be also very important to sociological history, the history of sociological theory and development, but were not traditionally included in the teaching of the canon. So first of all, Auguste Comte, he had his first and also most influential work called The Course in Positive Philosophy. That doesn't have the word sociology in it. So very importantly, one thing to remember is that for all of these 5 figures, okay, I guess except Durkheim, who actually held a job as a sociologist, so he was a professor in sociology, and he, at his time, that was the only job for titled sociology professorship in France as well for him for a long time. Apart from Durkheim, none of the other 4 people actually held a job as titled a sociologist in a way that is, what sociology at the time was. It was not yet institutionalized within university as a department as of today, okay? So that's something to bear in mind. So at the time, he called it positive philosophy. And he was remembered for coining or first using extensively the word sociology. And he decided that that means the scientific study of human society, which is quite similar actually to what we said in our previous lecture, right? But what he meant by scientific is very specifically positivist. What does that mean? Well, positivist in this particular sense means that we are borrowing the methods that natural sciences and more deductive sciences like mathematics, physics, right, what they're using into the study of human society. Okay? We're borrowing natural scientific methods to study of the social world. Actually, we can see from today the reason why all of the disciplines we showed up in last lecture were called social sciences. The word science in this particular context, right, does have that positivist flavor to it. And in that sense, a legacy of Comte. Okay. And he had an interesting idea of the different levels of complexity and importance of different disciplines. He actually thought, for example, that sociology was a lot more complex and harder than mathematics, because mathematics is so clean. Everything, when you say 1 + 1 is 2, unless, for example, you're a philosopher who really want to argue about this, most people would say, oh, yes, that's pretty apparent, and 1 + 2 is 3, right? There are a lot of theorems. They're so clean and always correct and always generalizable, universal. Whereas because of this empirical chaosness and predictability in human society, and also how we have agency and we're acting all in different societies, different time points, right? If we are trying to find these inner structures and patterns within society, that could be a lot messier and more complex than mathematics, right? So he did believe that sociology is like the ultimately hardest but quite important discipline for us to achieve. So one of his legacies, of course, is positivist sociology, and actually Émilie Durkheim is also a positivist, also French. But Karl Marx, some of us might have heard of him, Marxism and stuff, right, is very much concerned with the very particular injustice that and the suffering of workers who are put into selling their labor for money through the rise of capitalism. Okay. Until then, people lived in subsistence, meaning that I might be farming my own land, and I might not own this land, but always I can keep a portion of that to myself, what I harvest. I have an intimate, close relationship between me as the laborer and what I produce, okay? And yet right now, what happens is that I go to a factory, I sell my labor for wage, and they pay me something, but I never own the machine I'm using, the land I'm on, right, for producing any of this, and I don't own any of the stuff that's produced. And also, the person who hired me to produce all of these products, they don't really need it. What do they need it for? They are called commodities, needed for exchange, to sell it to others, to market, right? So that the person who hires me, the capitalist, the bourgeoisie, would own the benefit, the interest, the profit from selling, okay? And they also own what I produce until they sell it to someone else. All they need to do is to pay me wage. So Marx saw this as an intrinsically unjust system. In one way, it is also because of how terrible the working conditions in 19th century Britain was, which is where, and also other European countries, which is where he was kind of investigating, okay? So kids, women were doing unpaid, excessive labor, and everybody was lining up for overwork, and people's health were terribly compromised after such work. And yet all we are making is that wage for our labor on the factory spot. And once our health is completely exhausted and we leave the factory because we can no longer work, right? Nobody pays us any pension or any type of compensation for the lost health. And yet at the same time, there are so many other people that are trying to compete for the position that I was in as an exploited laborer or worker, okay? So for him, to do social theory is very closely interconnected with achieving a political project, okay? And as we said, Berger thought that being normative is not part of doing sociology. And yet for Marx, being normative, what we should and should not be doing is intrinsically tied to what sociology and social theory is, okay? We're already seeing how diverse, right, our discipline is. So Marx importantly saw class struggle. In capitalism, that meant the conflict between bourgeoisie and the proletariat as the engine of historical progression. So what that means, we will cover what bourgeoisie and proletariat a little bit deeper in lecture 5. But most simply, as I already mentioned, the bourgeoisie, they own the means of production, whereas the proletariat, they sell their labor for wage, okay? And they're exploited by the bourgeoisie because by doing nothing but owning the means of production and by paying the proletariat, they have access to all of the surplus capital that is generated when they're selling all of these products as commodities that are produced by the labor of the workers, okay? So he had a lot of different legacies, and one important one is conflict perspective. This perspective, if we think about it, is a main paradigm in sociology that prompts us to think about, okay, when I'm trying to analyze a social structure, I have to think about who are the people in what kind of positions are having all of the powers over maybe the rest of us or maybe certain components of the society, right? Because those also are the people a lot of times who are making the rules and the laws for everybody, so that over time we can, even if we're not one of those oppressors or rulers, we might still also identify with all of these rules and see them as legitimate, okay? In a simple way, for example, maybe until today when I talked about this, you might think, oh, of course, you know, I go to work and I pay a wage, I'm paid, right, a salary, that's like pretty natural. Well, that's not natural at all for Marx, okay? So that does, I hope, prompt us to rethink about different possibilities of how we can allocate social resources and to think more critically about who are the rule makers and who are the people that are being made decisions about, okay? And also, Karl Marx also historically inspired the communist revolutions, for example, China, USSR, Cuba, right? Were all underwent such revolutions, and some of us still claim that we're socialists or communist. Others kind of started opting more on the capitalist or free market kind of way, but still. And the third one, even today, in a lot of different schools, for example, Frankfurt School, whenever you hear the word critical theory and contemporary feminist theory, etc., based in continental Europe especially, and in the US, mostly in literary studies, a lot of people were inspired, okay, by this Marxist thought. And actually within the US sociology, there is less of such an attempt or influence, especially over time, like right now, less so. Although it remains very, very lively and important in many, especially other disciplines, okay, and other parts of the world who are doing sociology, where people are doing sociology. And then we're thinking about Max Weber and interpretivism, okay? So Max Weber took a very different view than Karl Marx when it comes to where is there intrinsic injustice, like in capitalist systems. He didn't really want to make a comment on that. He's like, I don't know, like it, but he was interested in at least how capitalism came into being, and he explained it through a very interpretivist view. What does that mean? Well, we can first think about this one. Verstehen is an important, like, German word for him. It means understanding as a way of doing science or social science. So the actor, we have to try to understand the actor from the subjects, from the actor's own point of view, from their own shoes, and focus on the meanings that they attach to their behavior. Remember, like in last lecture, we mentioned how that interpretivist processes were important, how they see their world, why they're doing what they're doing, right? How they make sense of everything. And whenever we are starting to think about meaning and values and making sense, stuff like religion, right? Or culture or music or beliefs start to become important, more important than things like what I own, like physically, right? So in Max Weber's interpretation, the spirit of capitalism was an accidental, unintended consequence of these Calvinists, or especially like a branch of Protestants who held this belief from their religious doctrine that God would reward individuals who are particularly hardworking in like the real life environment, and that they believed in predestination, meaning that regardless of, on the one hand, regardless of what you do, you cannot change if you can go to heaven or not when you die. But on the other hand, the people who are predestined, who are chosen to go to heaven, they will demonstrate certain signs when they're alive, like during their lifetime, such as they might be really hardworking and they might be living a very thrifty life, and they could be successful in business. And a lot of beliefs that are actually really associated with the business kind of success or doing capitalist trade for these people, when, very importantly, according to Max Weber, these successful capitalists and entrepreneurs, they were not particularly interested in making more money or living comfortably or being greedy. No, it is about their religious ethic, according to him, that actually accidentally prompted and made possible the spirit of capitalism as something that we can no longer get rid of once it is accidentally made. Okay, so and Max Weber had a lot of important work in different fields. So for example, as I said, he was not a sociology professor in any way. He was a professor in law and economics, and at the time there was no professor in sociology in Germany, okay? And he wrote about like the state, politics, intellectual life, bureaucracy, a lot of different topics. I just chose the religion and the spirit of capitalism because this is, I guess, his most celebrated work, first of all, and secondly, it kind of shows us the importance of thinking about Verstehen and thinking about interpretivism. when it is associated with things like culture and values as producing certain important outcomes, okay? But more generally, Max Weber also made a very important disciplinary kind of methodological contribution. He said that sociology should be concerned with the study of social action, according to him. And what is social action? That is action that is as its subjective meaning takes into account of the behavior of others, okay, or oriented towards others. Those actions are social actions. And Max Weber believes that studying social action and why they come about, that is a causal explanation of what it's like and what are its effects and why did it come about. These are the goals of the discipline of sociology. Okay? And also importantly, if you look at the book title Economy and Society, that is actually a collection of all of the things that he wrote, okay, and translated into English in the 1930s by Parsons initially from the US. This sociologist called Parsons, very influential himself as well. I'm going to write it down actually for you because it's important. Okay. Like the Protestant ethic. Oh, I stopped share again. Okay. So are we still recording? Yeah. And it's like all of these collection of essays that people found after his death, and it was not meant necessarily to be kind of a specific book on a specific topic. It's just everything that he wrote, okay? And within it, he discussed how important it is to what sociology in particular should be doing. So now let's take an example of what positivism versus interpretivism would be approaching the same topic of religion, okay? If you're a positivist, you're trying to use some of the natural science methods or scientific method, as in Kant's, right? You might be counting the number of religions, members of different religion in a certain culture, right? Or look for general laws. For example, Durkheim, we'll talk about him soon, argued that Protestants were more likely to commit suicide than Catholics. That's something he found. But an interpretivist might then interview people about their subjective religious identities. So for example, what does it mean for you to be a Christian? Was there a particular point where you converted? Is there any particular reason why you did that, right? And they might also compare how different people have different understandings of what being a Christian is. So, as I said, Durkheim is the only sociologist per se, right? So within all of these 5 guys, because he actually had a job called a sociology professor, okay? And so, for example, Marx was never a professor, okay? He was an independent scholar, and he was not paid for any of the work, the terrifically influential work that he did, okay? He was in poverty for a lot of his time as well, although he was sponsored by his best friend and also co-author Engels. So back to Durkheim and social cohesion. So social cohesion and collective consciousness, all of these concepts, solidarity, is extremely important for the sociologist Emily Durkheim. He was very interested in what it is that brings us together, that we come to, I believe, in similar things when there are so many different of us in the same society, and so that we can function and collaborate with each other or hold similar rituals, and how society can instill in us a type of collective consciousness to make us feel that type of solidarity. Okay, what brings us together? That is the type of question that Durkheim was particularly interested in, or at least one of the questions. But in general, this is also about, okay, when we are thinking about, okay, Max Weber, religion and how it relates to capitalism, for Durkheim also, capitalism, and for Marx, right, capitalism was a very prominent topic, modernity, for Durkheim too. Because when there was capitalism, there at the same time was what? The synonym, industrialization. And with industrialization and a lot of us, there was drastic social change. We used to be living in the same place. We know everybody in our small village, right? But suddenly now we're all going to these big cities to work in these factories. And a lot of social changes have happened. And maybe the way we think about, we feel what is valuable to us as human society members have changed as well. So in the past, maybe I get up and I do my ritual, I do my learning, but everything. Eventually I know, okay, I'm just gonna be a carpenter like my dad, right? But right now, different. All I think about is, oh, can I go to this big city to get this job as an entrepreneur, or maybe I become a worker, right? So a lot of changes happen in society. So he was interested in how in pre-modern society, people were pretty holding similar beliefs, doing similar job, right? And performing rituals to make us feel that sense of belonging, what he called mechanical solidarity. Whereas in modern society, there is a lot more interdependence between what each of us do. For example, think about yourself, the clothing you wear, the food you're eating, all of your toothbrush, right, your bread, the bus, the car you're driving, the road you're walking on. Do you know how to build them? Did you build them? Do you know the people who built them? No. Or made them? No. Whereas this is an important feature of modern society, that we are very strongly dependent, interdependent, between different members who are anonymous to each other. We don't know each other, we're strangers, and yet we make the society function, okay? And yet also at the same time, we might be holding very different values and beliefs, unless when we're still in that small, our village, or living together with the same group of people throughout our lives, right? So that is what he calls organic solidarity. And the last one of these five is George Simmel. Simmel was also German. He was pretty much appreciated by Max Weber. They were contemporaries. Max Weber was a recognized scholar at the time, whereas Simmel, he was very popular, like among certain circles, like among the public. He was very good at like delivering talks and stuff, but he was never kind of internationally distinguished or recognized as necessarily the best type of thinkers during his time. So for example, who we just talked about, Emily Durkheim, did not like Simmel's work, okay? But they just follow very different styles. And we're gonna explain a little bit. You're gonna start to know why from maybe tomorrow, why maybe Durkheim would not like it once you start to learn about the most important concepts that Durkheim built, social fact. In trying to establish sociology as a discipline, or in him conveying his idea of what sociology should be doing, okay? for Zimmel, it's not about fact finding. It's not about the empirical, like positivism, but it's about what he called social forms. What is that? So he considered sociology to be a new method which must discriminate between form and content of society. So what does that even mean, right? It sounds a little abstract. So let me give you an example, the type of things that he was talking about. So for instance, he would talk about things like dyads. What is a dyad? It's like two people forming ties, okay? Or he would talk about you being alone, or if it's a 3-person group, certain dynamics, specific dynamics associated with each of these 3 different types of being. Or so for instance, when we're studying any dyad, it could be a marital relationship, like couple, right? It could also be a friendship. It could also be between 2 countries. And yet Zimmel was able to discern very insightfully certain kind of shared dynamic across all of these different different types or contents of relationship that all fall into the form of a dyad. And that helps us with understanding how this particular structure, just they're these 2 people, versus, for example, if there are 3 people forming a group. Zimmel says that's a different social form, and it's called a triad, okay? Then the dynamic would change. For instance, he would say that there's this idea of a third who enjoys. So if some of us come from China, you would also know a similar expression in Chinese, right? If the scallop and the fish is trying to compete with each other, it's always the fisherman who is benefiting from the process, right? So it's quite similar to what Zimmel was talking about, the third who enjoys. So for example, he says historically in politics, if you're a small country, right, and there are 2 big countries with very different ideologies and they're kind of competitors against each other, one thing that some of the small countries do is to form ties with both of them, but not too close, neither too strong, until, of course, if they are threatened by both of them. So historically, for example, one terrific example I can think of is during the Ottoman Empire War. At the time, Istanbul, what currently is known as Istanbul, was at the time known as Constantinople, right? Or the center of the world. Very important, like today's Turkey, like Istanbul, Constantinople. And Ottoman Empire, the emperor has always wanted to conquer that city, okay, Constantinople. And yet at the time, it was the Eastern Romans who officially occupied that land. And Constantinople had very, very, very strong walls. But it was only until the Sultan or the Emperor of the Ottoman Empire, this particular one, who hired a very intelligent cannons or artilleries, that they were able to actually break the wall and to invade Constantinople, to eventually siege it and get it, okay? And yet this person who was hired by the Ottoman Sultan or the Emperor, known as Urban, was from Hungary, and he used to be working for the Roman side, okay? And yet when the Eastern Roman Emperor didn't have enough funding for him or use for him, I can go to the other emperor, like your enemy, and eventually your enemy is going to destroy you with my help. Well, unfortunately, he died actually from the war, from his own creation of the cannon itself, because it was not built well yet, and there was some accident and explosion that happened that kind of killed him, not kind of, actually killed him. But we can get that kind of idea, the third that enjoys, okay? And that is, if we think about it, with 2 people, with 1 person, with 4 people, can we have certain similar dynamics? Probably not. With 4 people, maybe too much communication going on in any of the 2, right? With 3, especially when 2 are in antagonistic relationship and we have a 3rd one, well, that person can broker and exploit the relationship between the other 2, right? So this is how, for example, a lot of the neutral smaller parties, they might be approached by the larger parties when we think about political voting, right? If you're a leader of some of the larger parties and one of the 2 larger parties and you're trying to compete with the other one, you want the favor from those smaller parties who were otherwise neutral. You want to win their favor. That is an example that Zimmel gave as well in his discussion of social forums and in triad, for instance. And also, Zimmel was simply precisely because of his study on these type of topics and group size and what is social relations, as we understand it, in particular for configurations of these different groups and connections. He's also now considered a founding father for social network analysis. Okay. In addition to that, Zimmel was also the first, or one of the first people to write very influentially about urbanization and its relationship to people's mind. So, for example, you had a very short but influential essay called The Metropolis and Mental Life. So he said that instead of reacting emotionally, the metropolitan type reacts primarily in a rational manner, meaning that he was talking about how a lot of people in the past, we lived in villages, very collective environment. We do everything together. We felt a lot of solidarity. We were very emotional beings. But once a lot of us start to live in these metropolitan areas, we might have a lot of transactions with everyone every day, right? Think about also what Durkheim was talking about, right? So organic versus mechanical solidarity. All of these solid exchanges. I go to the supermarket, to the grocery store to get my toothbrush and everything, my clothing, right? But I might not actually form or have or ever consider having any kind of deep, actual personal ties with the people that I'm having all of these interactions or transactions with, right? And blasé, or what he talked about as kind of this indifference, okay, is a very primary type of mentality that people who live in metropolitan areas would have, when it was never kind of the case in non-metropolitan traditional societies. And here, very importantly, if we think about the distinction between psychology and sociology, we now are like, oh, but Zimmel was interested then in psychology, I guess. Of course, in psychology. But this interest in psychology is related very closely and shaped by the larger social environment. Okay, that is where sociology comes in. So thinking about the founding fathers in a nutshell: Comte, positivism; Karl Marx, class conflict; Durkheim, thinking about social cohesion; Max Weber, interpretivism; and Zimmel, influencing us in terms of social networks. So Marx and a little bit of Weber that we'll talk about in a few lectures, they also both studied what divide us in terms of questions like social hierarchies and the power differentials, right? It was even clearer in Marx. Like that is like the primary thing he's interested in, whereas Weber is interested in all sorts of different things. And also Weber takes a more neutral perspective in terms of, oh, is this right or wrong that something divides us, okay? That's kind of the difference. But Durkheim and Comte are similar as both positivists. And Durkheim also is quite interested in what unites us, just as Simmel does. Although for Simmel, it's at a more kind of smaller group level, as I said, like individual, just one person lonely versus, I mean, a dyad or a triad or larger, slightly larger groups. Okay, that kind of dynamic level is slightly different. But also, if we think more broadly, as I said, all of these founding fathers kind of were born in the 19th century, sort of during the particular time period of industrial revolution and what French Revolution happened when people started to believe in things like reason instead of theology, instead of just God giving us revelations, right? Or beliefs of equality, all of these dramatic changes of capitalism that happened. So in that sense, we can also say that sociology as a discipline was, first of all, having its birthplace in Europe, as in today's, we understand as today's canon, but also all of these sociologists were interested in one broader theme, that is Europe's transition to modernity or capitalism or industrial society, okay? So this is actually taking the perspective of a sociology of sociology, if we think about it, right? So it's like we're using a sociological lens, which according to what C. Wright Mills said, oh, we have to think about the structure and the historical period of the time, right? Yeah, that's the historical period of time. That's what's happening. And that particular social environment conditioned and shaped the building of sociology as a discipline. Okay, so here the object of study is sociological knowledge itself. Okay, and by the way, that's actually what I study. So if you're particularly interested in the topic, reach out to me and I'm happy to talk more about it. But if you think about it, that makes kind of is one way to think about it, right? And to think about how sociological knowledge itself is culturally and historically embedded, we can also reflect on the processes through which these particular figures now are considered as founding fathers. For instance, they're all European white men, right? And importantly, there are other figures like Herbert Spencer, for example, that were extremely influential, probably more influential than most people here. Let me write his name down. But we're never taught, and we're barely taught today anymore. But at the time, in early 20th century, he was like the most influential, just as Auguste Comte, okay? Some were forgotten, right? Others were added. Let me share my screen again. So, and importantly, this means that this is a historical and sociological process in itself, that certain individuals work, despite among all of the works that are probably all very brilliant, and we have to say that intellectually, but some kind of survived and become known as canon and to be founding documents for sociology, whereas others were not. So, for example, women, people of color, people from non-European, non-Western origins, a lot of them have made very creative contributions to sociology as well, and yet a lot were forgotten, okay, or not as well emphasized. There are reasons of differential power relations, resources, privileges, and discrimination, right? So this in itself kind of holds a conflict perspective here, right? If we think about it. And for American sociology and in the English world in particular, some of these figures were Martino. So she was the one who translated Colt's work to English first, okay? And Jane Addams was very influential. She, and interesting, was an activist and social reformer herself. That's what she was known for. As I mentioned in lecture 1, there's been actually a marriage between missionary purposes and all of the social welfare activism together with sociologists in forming sociology departments in universities, or making sociology an academic discipline in the particular history of American sociology. And she was very important in the city of Chicago in helping educate a lot of then like sociologists who were teaching sociology, for instance. But also she was doing a lot of social welfare work that were beneficial to the community and were very influential in the whole Chicago. So we know the University of Chicago actually is quite influential for the entirety of American sociology history, and she was an important figure in that as well. Okay, and also another figure, Du Bois. So he wrote a lot about Black individuals' experiences, and he was also trained at Harvard, so he was kind of in some of those canonized schools, at least those very elite schools, and he had access to some of the best resources and documents in doing his research, and had a lot of creativity. Some say he's too good for sociology, right? So in a sense that he had both this kind of commitment to anti-racist research. So he, for example, important concepts like double consciousness, or the simple question, what does it feel to be a problem, right? As a Black person, for example. Those very important contributions that he made that are getting increasingly recognized by scholars, such as today, she's contemporary Patricia Collins, writing about a lot of these different contributions. For next class, we're going to talk about social facts and research method, and your reading would just be required this time, colon textbook, chapter 2. Okay.